Welcome to the podcast where relationships, confidence, and determination all converge into an amazing, heartfelt experience. This is Speaking from the Heart.
Welcome back to episode number 119 of Speaking from the Heart. Today we have yet another international guest coming from the great country of Australia. His name is Simon Rinne, and Simon is a social worker and founder of Mindful Men. Mindful Men, a therapy practice that is dedicated to supporting men with mental illness and disability. Simon's passion for mental health comes from living with obsessive-compulsive disorder, better known as OCD, depression, anxiety, and also burnout throughout the last 30 years. During this time, he struggled in silence, believing that boys and men can't cry, all while using alcohol as a way to feel normal. At the age of 28, Simon finally reached out for help, and ever since then has been on a journey of healing. By sharing his story, Simon hopes to inspire others to believe that they can turn their pain into purpose and move from surviving to thriving. I don't think I would have ever met my doppelganger that has been through so much to get to where they are today, to even open their own practice, their own business, to be able to help others, especially with men who I think are so undervalued in today's society, given the fact that we've been told all of our lives that we should not be showing any type of emotion, that we should be the stronger person. But I think today you're going to be surprised by not only what I've just shared, but also what Simon even elaborates on that just shocks me to the core of not only what he's been through, but how he keeps moving himself to the other side. Because essentially it isn't just about men or women, but it's about what we are dealing with as a whole, which is a lot of different issues that humanity needs to start focusing on instead of fighting each other. If we're ever going to make progress, it means that we have to stop looking at things that we think we need to be and become something that we ever thought we could be instead. But with that, let's go to the episode. All right, we're here with Simon Rinne. Simon, thanks for sharing your heart with us today.
Josh, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to our chat.
Absolutely. And I want to acknowledge the fact that maybe people already noticed with your accent that you are from the great country of Australia, which I've always enjoyed having guests on the show coming from other places. So thanks for taking some time with the huge time difference to be able to do this today.
No, my pleasure. It's nice and early here, so I'm an early starter and love coming on the shows all over around the world. I do this all the time, as we're talking about off air, and really enjoy talking about what we're about to talk about with people just from different walks of life. So excited to be here.
I am too. And speaking of that, my audience heard a little bit about your background, and I really am excited by the fact that you've been through so much, which I know sounds really weird to say excited because there's a lot of different things that you've been through. But for somebody like myself, I've actually been through a lot of these different things, depression, anxiety. I've had suicide thoughts about 4 years ago. I've gotten over that hurdle. It's been an incredible journey to get to that side. And I'm really interested in your story to start off as to how you got to where you are and where you situated yourself today. So I'm wondering if you could tell a little bit about your pain story. I think that's the way to encapsulate it because it's turned it into your purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. So turned 40 last year, so what's 2024 this year, turning 41. And my story spans over for the majority of my life. So for 30 odd years or so, I lived with mental health conditions. I still live with mental health conditions, but they're not as prevalent these days. They're not as painful these days as they used to be. But I grew up in the 80s, 90s in a place called Adelaide, South Australia. So it's a little bit different to where I'm living at the moment. And during those 80s, 90s, it was a period of time and a place in the world where mental health discussions weren't a thing. In fact, it was quite the opposite. It was to be a boy, to be a man, was to be someone who would suck everything up, to carry on, to move on, to bury everything deep down and dare not talk about your vulnerabilities or your authenticity as a boy, because if you did, you'd be labelled as gay or a girl or a wuss or a sissy, all these types of things, which a lot of people don't want to be labelled those types of things. They want to be seen for who they really are. But for me, and for so many other boys and men, not just in Australia but around the world, it's a period of time where they had to bury it all down. They had to put on this persona of being strong and so forth. And this really became important for me around 8 years old when I developed obsessive compulsive disorder. And for the next 20 years, that remained undiagnosed. So I really struggled with my mind and it racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour and doing these behaviors to alleviate anxiety that rose through obsessive compulsive disorder. Didn't know what OCD was back then. In fact, I didn't know what it was until I was 28 and diagnosed. And during that period as well, there's bouts of depression, bouts of anxiety. In my teens, mum and dad separated, so I became the man of the house, whatever that looked like in the 80s and 90s, and felt this overwhelming need to protect and to be safe and to feel safe and all this type of stuff. And this is where my OCD really ramped up, and I would spend hours and hours each day checking doors, locks, checking gates were closed, checking that irons weren't going to burn the house down, all these types of things to try and keep us safe. And it almost nearly killed me. I got to a point where I didn't want to continue living anymore. And these were my darkest days in my early teenage years. But those dark days spanned probably the next decade as well. I found alcohol and used alcohol to suppress everything, to feel normal, to slow the mind, to have relief, but also to feel joy again as well. And so I struggled with all this stuff. Didn't know what it was though. Struggled internally, tried to outthink it, tried to go for a run to outrun it, if that makes sense. And it was 28 that I got diagnosed after a few years of encouragement from my now wife to go and see someone about my mental health. And I really didn't know what to expect going into a doctor's office or to a psychologist's clinic. And I expected a magic wand to be waved and I'd be healed, and that didn't happen. And so from that point, about 11 years ago now, been on a continuous, I guess, journey of discovery about what works for me, what heals me, what helps. And over that time, I've learned that there are different people that I get a lot of value from a therapy perspective. There's different modalities from a therapy perspective that I like. There's an importance for things like self-care, so sleeping well, eating well, exercising. One of the more recent pennies that have dropped for me is that alcohol isn't the answer to mental health conditions. And so I got sober at 40. So I've been sober since 40 years old, last August. And in this process of self-discovery, discovered mindfulness. And that came about after burning out in 2020 as well. And recognizing that I can no longer continue living the life I was living. One that was, first of all, bottling everything up for so long. And then also doing these destructive behaviors, so the drinking excessively to numb everything, because I'd become essentially a shell of a person, and a person who was living two different lives. On the outside, it would be like, oh yeah, Simon's this typical Aussie bloke who just gets on with things, nothing phases him, all this type of stuff. He's wearing this mask really well, but internally I was a complete shell of a person. Even though I'd done all the things, I'd had 2 university degrees, a family, I'd worked in a successful career, I'd have a house. There's nothing for me on paper to complain about, but all those complaints were internalized from, I guess, historical social constructs of what it means to be a man, that suck it up mentality. And I bought into it like so many guys do. So I've brushed over quite a lot of my life in terms of the pain. I'm happy to explore that, but essentially it just paints the picture of all these things that I've struggled with for so long. And in fact, I thank burnout for happening, because it was that moment where I started to actually turn that pain story into one of thriving and instead of surviving, one of taking it and going, you know what, I'm going to do something with this. I'm not just going to sit here and wallow in my own self-pity. I'm actually going to use this as fuel for something. And that turned out to be becoming a social worker and opening my own therapy clinic dedicated to men's mental health and disability. So brushed over it very quickly for you, but let's unpack it together.
Yeah. I actually do want to unpack a couple things. But first off, I want to celebrate your sobriety. That's a big deal. I know a lot of people that are recovering from alcohol, and they have gone through the gambit of trying to stay consistent. And I think that you can almost tie it to eating disorders. You almost have to stay away from those because of the triggers that are involved. And I know some people growing up, even through college, I knew a young lady that was anorexic and was definitely bulimic in nature as well. So there was a lot of those aspects that I can associate with what you're saying, although I never had somebody directly in my family dealing with alcohol. I know that that's a big deal, especially since I still see a therapist after all this time, and I still see people coming in to get alcohol treatment. So kudos to you for accomplishing that more recently. I'm curious, though, because you mentioned about all these different diagnoses, and a lot of people, especially today, they like to say, well, yeah, you have all these things going on. There's a lot of different things that you can get help for now as a result. But man, that's just an excuse. You should suck it up and deal with it. And that's been the biggest problem, especially for males. And you and I were chatting a little bit about this beforehand, about the fact that sometimes it's undervalued, especially fathers that might have a lot of responsibility, even single men that carry that shame, that guilt. So I'm curious, how have you been able to use that to empower yourself outside of even starting Mindful Men, which we'll talk about soon? But I'm wondering if there's been a catalyst, because you said that the burned out actually helped you to recognize that. So I wonder if you could talk about that a bit.
As a therapist, like a lot of people say, I'm not my diagnoses, or I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm me. And part of me agrees, but part of me goes, what knowledge is power? For so long, I was powerless to mental illness. I didn't know what was going on. If you don't know what's going on, how are you going to be able to fix it? Or how are you going to be able to help it? If your car's making a funny noise, if you don't go and see a mechanic, how will you ever know what's actually wrong with your car? And so finding that diagnosis, it was empowering back in 2012. But at the same time, as I said before, like I expected a magic wand response. I didn't dive real deep and go, okay, what is OCD? What's the best treatment for OCD? That came later in life after I burned out. And even burnout, I didn't know what burnout was until I experienced it. So I'm sitting in the work office, working in this high pressure environment where it's just go, 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 kind of like a conveyor belt of administrative work, just never ends. And so I've got that component. I was studying my master's degree in social work. We'd had 2 kids under 3. This thing called COVID came along and we were locked down. And I was working in this very room at the time when the straw broke my camel back, if you could say that. And I remember being on a call with my manager who was asking me, Simon, why is all this work getting longer and longer for you to complete? And I essentially broke down and cried. And it's the first time I ever cried in front of somebody that wasn't my wife, essentially, and said, I'm burnt out. And this is the start of me taking off this mask, saying, I'm sick of sucking it up. I'm tired of sucking it up. I want to just express myself in a way that means something to me. And for a lot of guys, that's anger. But for me, it was just crying. I just wanted to release the pressure valve of life and deal with whatever was going on. And internally, I knew it was all the mental health stuff as well. It was all this 30 years of pain, all the drinking, all that type of stuff. I knew it all, but I just buried it deep. And burnout enabled me to start talking about this type of stuff. And it just coincides with finding mindfulness, talking to my GP, talking to a social worker about what was going on and putting life into context, going, you know what? Getting into your 30s now, it's funny when we're in our 30s, 40s, we often still think we're in our early 20s in our mindset as well. We're like indestructible.
Yes.
We have the same beliefs or similar beliefs. We have similar interests as well, all this type of stuff. And so it was a recognition that I wasn't that person anymore. I'm older. I'm more mature. I've got kids now. I'm moving towards becoming a therapist, and I've got to be a therapist. I've got to act like a therapist and think like a therapist. I can't act like this 20-year-old version of me, kind of stuck in time, like on a loop in my mind. And so burnout enabled me to talk about stuff and gave me this confidence. And it did so because part of my recovery from burnout was sharing the story more broadly. And I felt this sense of people can finally see me for who I was by sharing that story. And that looked like going back to work after about 4 months off and talking to the office about burnout, because I knew other people were struggling and they just didn't know what burnout was or mental health. And I wanted to normalize mental health discussions and bring it to the forefront. And COVID, I think, enabled that because we were working from home for such a long time and now lockdowns, and businesses and managers would start calling us and every week and say, how is your mental health? How are you going? First time ever in my career that anyone did that. Anyone cared about that type of stuff. So I'm like, you know what? I'm taking this ticket and I'm going to jump on this train and I'm going to start sharing. And it felt amazing. So I didn't want us to stop there. And it led to me starting my own podcast, the Mindful Men podcast, my social media, eventually my business as well. And I just felt this empowering energy come through me going, you know what? I'm done with the pain. It's time to start moving forward. And I've seen so many eyes light up when I'm sharing the story, not just in podcasts, but in my family, my wife, my kids. They see what I'm doing with Mindful Men. They love it. They've got their little Mindful Men t-shirts and hats and all the merch, and they're coming along for the ride. But it's also in the work that I do in my therapy clinic, seeing guys open up and me sharing some of that story to help them and inspire them to open up. And it's an amazing feeling. But for so long, I didn't do it. And I wish I did it earlier, but I just didn't have those words. I didn't have the know-how, the drive. You know, I was so self-absorbed in my own pain. I couldn't see the forest from the trees, if that makes sense.
Not only does that make sense, but it has flashbacks for me. I'm sitting here thinking about what had happened to me. My audience knows this from those that have been following since episode 1 for me, because I've shared a lot about my journey with other guests. But to give you the Cliff Notes version, Simon, I definitely had that the day before my 33rd birthday. That was when it all went down. And it was about 3 or 4 weeks before the COVID shutdown itself. So that was the double whammy in my life. And that made me realize I have a supportive boss, which at the time I did. She completely understood what was happening and made me feel like I was okay to process that and deal with it. But the second thing that you said is navigating through that to get to your calling, which it took me about a year before I finally realized the darts started to click, because I was putting off the pain. I was putting off the pain for so long that when it came to actually digesting it, I was literally talking about this even the evening before we did this recording with my therapist. I put 12 different defense mechanisms up just to defend myself from all these different things. So we put these barriers up. So that makes me really want to ask this question. Do you feel satisfied or happy about what you're doing now, not only in your life, but in also helping others? I'm really wondering, as a person that has gone through this, I often ask myself, do I feel satisfied with it? And I always have to revisit that question from time to time, make sure that I'm doing that reality check, because I don't want to go down that path ever again. So I think I'm trying to give you that opportunity to self-check now and be like, Are you doing okay?
Yes. Well, yes and no. As a small business owner, like I have my daily struggles in my small business, but in saying
Likewise.
that, when I set up the business and set out this course of becoming a therapist, I always wanted to be the guy for another guy. I wanted to be that guy who I never had growing up, who I could go and talk to about stuff. And knowing that I have a clinic now, a therapy clinic, where guys come to me to share their story, I think is a daily reminder that I'm living that dream and that I am doing well and I'm on the right path and I'm using that pain for purpose now. In fact, I have so much purpose that my brain can only take so much, but I have all these ideas that come up of how we're going to change the world through a mental health lens. And I get and this is where I probably went a bit of my downfall, is I get so excited by it that I start doing all these little projects and then they never come to fruition because I run out of energy. And so for me, it's not so much about not being well, it's more around sustaining the energy, because I'm so excited about what we're doing in Mindful Men, both from a therapy perspective, but also a brand, a community, and all the things, the ideas that I've got in my head for where it's going to go in the future to support men with mental health, disability all over the world, not just in Australia, but all over the world.
That's a big vision. And I think that that vision is so worthwhile. So let's talk about it, because you started Mindful Men, and that was, as you said, an offshoot of being through all these different types of things in your life. I am interested, though, because you are a social worker, which in the United States, we have our own sort of regulations when it comes to being certified, being able to work with others. And unfortunately, I feel that even nowadays, the United States can do a much better job with social services, helping those that are desperately in need. I know I've could have used one of these people in my life going through some of the troubles that I've had. But I'm kind of curious from your take, how has it been to be a social worker, to have that credential, starting the business, and also utilizing that to your advantage? Because I wanted to say earlier, guilty as charged because of all those different project ideas too. I feel like we get super excited in our craft and we want to do so many things because we got so much energy, but not enough time, and we don't have enough resources, and we have to budget our time and our resources. So it's a never ending vicious cycle. But I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about how that interplay with being a social worker and starting Mindful Men also came into play.
Yes, it takes me back to high school. So this is a long time ago now, but at the end of the 90s, and I'm coming to the end of high school, and you kind of start thinking, okay, what's next? What's after high school? And in the area that I grew up, very few people went to university. In fact, it would come from a lower socioeconomic location. Not many people go. And if you do get in somehow, you don't tend to stick around. Because where I grew up, it was very working class. It was trades, a lot of unemployment, people on welfare, a lot of drugs, crime, all that type of stuff. It wasn't a nice place to grow up and live. And I'm sorry, Mum and Dad, but they still live there, but they love it there, but not for me. And I remember saying to myself, I want to work in a job that helps people like me. I said this to myself and stumbled across a psychology degree that I could go do. I magically got into university, started that psych degree, got to the second year when they started bringing in subjects around mathematics and statistics, and that was just not my strong point. I like words and I like hearing people's stories. I don't like sitting there crunching numbers. And I'm like, why is this even part of a psychology degree? And so I dropped out. And I went on this 15-year career in the public service. But as a mature age student, when I went back and did social work, that came about because I was done doing that public service career. It wasn't lighting me up. I wanted more. I now knew what different types of career pathways looked like because it was something that we talked about. And so I jumped into my local university and spoke to a careers counsellor, which I've never done before. I thought, I'll talk to someone and say, this is kind of what I want to do. And they pitched social work to me because I was actually leaning towards counselling. But they said social work, and we talked about that. And what jumped out to me, and it's kind of like what we were talking about before, is social work enabled me to be creative. And it wasn't going to put me in a box where I had to be a counsellor or I had to be a psychologist and just do the same thing day in, day out. If I got bored of mental health in social work, I could just go and do child protection, or I can go and do policy or advocacy or work in homelessness shelters. I can do a whole range of things which wouldn't happen if I was a counsellor or a psychologist. And so that really drew me, and I'm like, you know what, I like that. And then as I was going through my social work degree, I've got this vision of becoming an accredited mental health social worker here, which is the top level of social worker here in Australia. I also didn't want to be in a therapy clinic doing 6 sessions a day, day after day, day after day, because that would just bore the hell out of me. Yes, I'd like the conversations, but I'd been in a public service career where I had to sit in a cubicle and do that type of monotonous conveyor belt style work. And so as I was completing...
Guilty as charged.
Yeah. And
I still do that even as I start my business. So I have to admit that, yeah, in the United States, public service, I get it. I've sat in those cubicles.
Absolutely.
I understand.
I didn't want that anymore. I wanted to start living life by design. And so I purposely, when I set up Mindful Men as a business, I gave away with the clinic space. In fact, I only go to a clinic once every fortnight for a couple clients, but the rest of my time I designed it so that it's out and about in community. And so instead of doing 6 sessions a day in a clinic, I might be on a Zoom call one moment, the next moment I might be walking on the beach with a guy, the next moment I might be going for a drive with a guy or getting a coffee, or there's one guy that used to love Macca's drive-through, so we'd go through and get McDonald's, and we would do it in therapy in this way that is accessible for guys. It makes therapy not look like therapy or feel like therapy because it just looks like 2 guys catching up for an hour in their week, having a bit of a laugh, having a bit of a cry, and then leaving it on a good note with some tools, strategies, tips, whatever. But again, it brings in that creativity. And I think creativity is really important for me. And it was really important to come out of burnout, because when you burn out, all the joy in life disappears. And what I was yearning for was creativity, to get out of that cubicle, to be creative and to do things differently. And that's what I've taken from social work and then put that into my career now as a social worker / men's therapist.
That is so interesting to me that I wish that we had more people here in the United States embrace some of those same practices that you're doing, because I feel that we get into this stodgy, traditional, oh, well, you come meet in my office, lay down on my couch and tell me your woes. You'll feel so much better afterwards. But it's a lot more than just listening to that, which I'm not displacing the fact that that's really important. But I think that we need to do a lot more. We need to be involved with that to help them get to an environment that makes them feel a lot more comfortable. So I love what you're doing to help that facilitation of that process. Simon, I really want to touch on this quick because you and I were talking about this before the show, and I know that for many of my listeners, they have an interest in this topic because, especially in the United States, it's a big deal. And it's about fathers and the mental health aspect of it. And I'm just curious, maybe you can take it in the context of one of your clients, which by all means, I would not ask you to name that person whatsoever. I believe in confidentiality. I do that in my own business too. So I wonder if there is somebody, though, or maybe a group of people that you could talk about that you've helped with overcoming issues that might relate to being a father or fatherhood for that matter, because it can also be just as lonely because you think, well, I got the kids, I got the wife, the perfect life, but that's not always the case. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, take a big chunk from me because I'm a dad. So I've a dad of a 4-year-old and an almost 7-year-old. He's about to turn 7 very soon. But a lot of mine, again, as a lived experience therapist, I draw from my own life and stuff like that. And thinking about my youth, yes, I lived with dad and dad's still around and all that type of stuff. But he was never the one to sit down and share stuff about, talk about anything other than what we were doing on the sports field or what we were doing at school. It was very much superficial. And when I became a dad, I didn't want to be like that. I wanted to be more involved in my kids' lives, to be the one that they go to. But often what happens, and the same happens with the guys that I work with in my clinic, is something happens when they become a dad and they kind of revert back to the version of parenting that they learnt from their father. And it's often something that they don't like. For example, one these days is smacking. Did they smack their child? They were smacked when they were a kid. So when their child plays up or misbehaves, they automatically, innately go to smacking. And so I'm talking to guys about that. And I had that as well when my son was born and he was a bit older and I reverted back to that 80s version of parenting because I used to get belted and pretty hard. Now, I didn't belt my son, but I smacked him on the top of his hand once and I hated myself for it. In fact, I still this was years ago, and I still think about that and go, no, that's just not what we do in the 2020s. That should be left in the 80s. It shouldn't even maybe exist in the 80s. So things like that, thinking about what we did, but not being hard on ourselves as parents and going, you know what, we're just doing the best with the knowledge that we have. And a lot of that knowledge just comes from our own childhood. And then fast forward to, we talked about alcohol and stuff like that. So my kids were the driver for me to get sober. Alcohol became a part of my life in my teens, initially to have fun and all that type of stuff, but then it became a self-medication coping mechanism for mental health. And over the last, say, 6-12 months, I've started to think to myself, you know what, I'm not really enjoying alcohol anymore, but I'm doing it to manage life, to cope with stress. And I also felt, because I'm a therapist, very guilty because I'd have guys come into my clinic with alcohol issues. Dads, they'd come in and say, I drink too much because I'm stressed. And I would say all the therapy things, say, you know what, you maybe need to cut out alcohol. But I wasn't doing the same. And so I felt like a fraud almost, that I would say these things. I know that alcohol is a depressant, for example, but they'd be in a clinic saying one thing but doing the other. But how my kids helped me with that is that they actually started going, Daddy, it's the weekend, would you like a beer? And I'm not the dad that
Wow.
trained my kids to go get the beer. I'm like, oh yeah, I'll go grab a beer and stuff like that. Or we're having lots of conversations in the car. So my wife, not a big drinker, right? And when I drank, it was pretty much you're going there and you're going to have a good time. And if I wasn't driving the car though, because I'm usually the guy that drives the car in the family, they'd be like, why is Daddy not driving? Mummy, why are you driving? And so we'd have to have a chat about alcohol. And it's like, oh, well, you don't drink and drive and all this type of stuff, which is all a very normal conversation to have. But I'm just like, man, I hate having these conversations with my little kids in the car. It's not a conversation I want to have. And so these types of things were playing in my mind. And it got to a point on my 40th birthday when people were giving me gifts. And I think, oh, this is my 40th. Like, this is a big birthday for me every decade. And the majority of gifts I got were alcohol. And I said to my wife, I said, why is this the case? It's my 40th birthday. She goes, Simon, that's because that's the identity that people know you. They know you like a drink. And so all these things, and particularly my kids and being that father figure, this all just didn't sit well with me. So these were catalysts for me to give away the booze. And so bring that again into my therapy clinic in the work that I do as a lived experience therapist. If they say, Simon, I'm struggling with alcohol or addiction or something like that, I say, you know what? I kind of get it. I've been there. And what this enables, and particularly working with guys who haven't been in therapy, having someone who kind of has walked in similar shoes on a similar journey, not the same because it's always different, it helps just them to relax and go, you know what? I can say whatever about alcohol now and know that you're not going to judge me. And it's so true. That's what I love about being a lived experience therapist. Now, you talked about regulation in the US and all that type of stuff. And a lot of therapists, even here in Australia and in America, I do interview a lot from all over the world. There's this fear in therapists to really be their authentic selves and to say, yeah, I'm a lived experience therapist. I've experienced depression or suicidal ideation or alcohol misuse or whatever it is, because we're taught in the education system that self-disclosure is wrong and it's not about you. And I agree to some extent. Yes, a client is paying for our time to help them with their issue. But if you can create a much stronger therapeutic rapport or therapeutic relationship with your client by just giving them a snippet and say, hey, you're feeling depressed, I felt similar, and let's talk about that and some strategies, and turn it around with a tip or a tool or a strategy that is useful for them. There's a lot of power in that. And so taking the fatherhood stuff, the drinking stuff, the smacking stuff, losing your anger. Anger is a big thing for guys and dads. They don't want to be angry, but they're so wound up, or they've been taught for so long, like we talked about earlier, like to suck it up and to don't talk about things, that it just eventually all becomes like volcanoes and they get angry and get violent or they scream or whatever. And so just drawing on this and going, you know what, I'm a guy, I get it. I know what that's like. Let's talk about that and share stories, because I get as much from them sharing stories as they do from me sharing my story. And so we share. It's a sharing thing. And it's not just about me being on a pedestal as a therapist. It's about me sitting with my client at their same level, talking the same language and working through it as a team, as opposed to me just being the almighty person of wisdom and knowledge, which I'm not. I've got a degree, yeah, but I don't know everything about everything. I know a little bit about something. And so together we can come up with the best solution. And it's all about drawing from that lived experience, whether it's fatherhood, masculinity, whether it's public servant life, whether it's student life. I've got all these different versions of me that I can draw from and really support guys in a way that means something to them.
I think even in my business of coaching and helping others to see a different perspective, especially working through a challenging idea or a presupposition about themselves, first off, I always give the work of diving into, well, what's the root cause of that to the therapist, because I'm not a counselor by any means. But if someone's really working through and they're really serious about challenging themselves to get to that destination that they really need to get to, I think it's really important to do that.
Yeah.
So, Simon, we're pretty much at the end of time here. I want to give you the last few minutes, though. I would love for you to give our audience some information about Mindful Men, where they can reach out if they're interested in learning more about your company and also the services it provides. I wonder if you could just give us maybe a 30-second overview of that, and also a little bit about how they can reach out to you. But I'm going to give you the last few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Mindful Man is a therapy business in Australia. So I only do therapy work in Australia. I am looking at coaching in the future to maybe go more globally. So watch this space. But also, if you come to the website, so it's www.mindful-men.com.au. That also links to my social media. I'm very active on social media, including the Mindful Men podcast. So we just have these exact same conversations on that podcast. But I've also got a free Facebook community group for men to come in and talk about mindfulness and connect with other people from around the world and just essentially feel less lonely in the world and connect and be mindful about life and share stories and inspire each other, basically. So it's an extension from this conversation into that Facebook group if people want to come in and connect there. But other than that, head over to the website, learn a bit more about me, connect on social media. I'm always happy to connect and talk and share whatever I can to lighten someone else's day.
You lighten up my day because you're not only on the other side of what you've been through, but you're doing some awesome work helping others. And for somebody like you, I realize now that there's a lot of people just like me that have been through this, and it's great to have great company. As a matter of fact, I wrote down the group because I will definitely join myself because I would love to have that interaction of people supporting each other. So with all that said, I'm going to put everything that people can reach out to you in the episode notes. So if you want to check that out, check out Simon's website. That'd be a great opportunity to support. But I have to tell you, for somebody that has been through OCD, anxiety, depression, alcoholism, all those things, and yet you are running, I think, a very important initiative for not only your country, but for the world to help continue empower and keep this conversation going, because I think we need to be heard as opposed to crying in the corner, because it is okay to cry, by the way, too. I've cried plenty of times on this show, even, Simon. So keep on crying for me, because I don't think that we need to suppress it anymore. We need to keep talking about it. So for all those reasons, thanks for being on Speaking from the Heart. Thanks for sharing your heart about these experiences. And God bless you, man. Keep doing what you're doing and keep helping others see their true light.
Josh, thank you. I've really enjoyed this chat, and thank you for all the work you're doing. You're doing an amazing job, and keep these conversations going because they're so important for the world today.
Again, I want to thank Simon so much for spending some time with me to conduct this interview, especially being halfway across the world to be able to do this. I love the perspectives every single time that we get on this show as it relates to not only our international guest, but how we can be able to diagnose a variety of different situations that are happening both in our countries, especially since they are so intertwined. They're all interrelated. And that's what's really the most important thing about this conversation, is that we have to overcome different perceptions of what we might think is a problem. We have to be able to learn and understand how we can use this information that we even gleaned from today's show to put it into practice. So let's dive right into it. Because we all have these different ideas of what it means to be successful. Success is often dictated to not only the genders that we have in this world, regardless of whether you identify as a male, female, or something else. But even if we push that all aside for a second, we have to think about the fact that these subjects that we are dealing with, these are actual human beings. They have actual issues. So how do we get to having a conversation about solving these issues instead of avoiding them? I think Simon is taking some of those first steps into moving into that direction. We have to be able to start talking about these subjects so that we are able to learn a lot more about what's happening, but also start addressing the bigger picture. But the question always becomes, should we? Well, let's look at it this way. Do you feel that you always have to protect others and what they have to say? Do you have to share in safety, or can you share in pain? Knowing that when you are sharing it out because of pain, it starts to turn into a purpose. Essentially what Simon even says in his intro. We have to learn to understand that with people sharing these sort of aspects of pain and frustration and guilt and shame, we can get value from it. Who do you get that value from is a whole other question in itself. Because the people that might be giving you that, whether they are actually authentic in nature, is really a big conversation piece in itself. But I think everybody has a story, and that story needs to be shared, especially if that story has a lot of self-care to go along with it. Is everything perfect on the inside, the outside? What are you trying to do in order to help yourself understand what that knowledge is that you need to create? And I think that Simon's story really exemplifies the fact that we can't always strive for perfection. We have to learn, even as men for that matter, that we need to be able to express what is on our hearts, on our minds. We need to be able to be in a context where it's okay to do that. And I love the fact that we have even groups for that matter that Simon's even started that is helping to address this cause. Even in my own backyard here in South Central Pennsylvania in the United States, there are a variety of different men groups that are trying to help address some of these issues that have been plagued for so long, about the importance of not only listening to yourself, but listening to others in a men context. It doesn't mean that you're forming a cult, or you are weak, or you should be shameful. Those are old, outdated ideas that we need to start understanding that even if we think about these ideas today as being old and outdated, we need to keep shifting that conversation forward. We need to keep pushing ourselves in a direction that allow us to understand that we need to start talking instead of burning out. Because burnout seems to be what causes this engagement in the first place. Huh? What? What do you mean by that? Burnout and creates engagement? That's hogwash. Why would you ever say that, Josh, on a show in which you talk about self-development, creating relationships, confidence, determination? Why would you say that you need to burn out so that you would have then that engagement? I know I must be a hypocrite today, but let's face it, if I didn't burn out, I wouldn't be behind a microphone right now talking to you, my listeners, for so long now, after over 119 episodes when this episode airs. Burnout can make such a big difference in creating that engagement. Sometimes some people have to get to the end of their rope before they finally reach out and they realize their true potential. Just like Simon's story today really exemplifies, not only because of the things that he's been through, but because he's realized that the truth comes from not only how we can help others, but how we can help ourselves. I think the question really becomes, when is the time to light up and move on? When do we actually flip the switch to say that we had enough, that we don't need to live in this life of misery and guilt and shame, and be able to push forward? How can we be that guy, or even that gal for that matter, that is able to grow up, to be able to understand that we might need to lean on different people, different places, different things that are healthy and positive, not unhealthy and negative. Sustaining the energy to build all these areas of the future is really the key. And I've talked about on a variety and other shows about the importance of having your tribe, being able to learn and understand that there's different people that we need to interact with. But the kinds of people that interact with you are also the key too. And as I've even put to some of my clients, you have a choice as to who you associate with and who you do not. And I know that might be so easy to say, but in practice, it's not so easy to say. It does put you in a place of guilt, being alone for that matter. And I know loneliness in itself is an epidemic that needs to be challenged as well. But of course, that is lumped in with all the other things that are happening. The mental health crisis, alcoholism, addiction to porn. No matter what kind of subject matter that you want to talk about, the things that we have as energy sustain itself from the things that not only we digest in society, but even as we've talked about on an interview episode, it's about the food that we consume. But let's really get to the heart of this. It's really about being fathers. Fathers in which we're able to help our children. But it doesn't necessarily always have to be children. We can be fathers of other men. People in which they're looking for that guidance on a variety of different issues. So that we can stay involved, not only with the challenges of today, but to continue to press forward with the challenges that will happen in the future. And how we address those issues and how we work on our identity, especially with fathers in mind, plays such a pivotal role. And which is why I think society needs to get back on track with having that engagement at all levels. Now, I'm a coach, and I'm here to help people realize their true potential, whether they find their voice through public speaking, whether they find goals in which they align themselves with in life, or they're just trying to find a career or a business that will help them create the best potential that they will ever have. But in a way, whether you're a father, you're a mother, you're a grandmother, you're a grandfather, regardless of what your role is in society, even if you're just a single white male, that's right, a single white male like myself, you have a place on this earth. Because we are all equal, no matter which way you look at it. I think that we often get confused by the fact that when people go through so many different trials and tribulations in life and have had so many hardships, whether they have been in jail or they have been through something else, you have to understand that the negativity that is often stigmatized because of being through some of these situations need to stop. It's hurting people. It's creating situations in which we have to have groups like Simon's, even in Australia for that matter, to be able to help others see that they are worth something because they've lost what that value is along the way. You have to learn the fact that if we're going to be able to protect others, if we're going to overcome the perceptions that we have in society, if we're going to be able to be perfect, whether there is any perfection in this world to begin with, which I would argue there isn't, we have to learn that we have to stop letting it wait until the very last minute. We need to stop burning out. I should ask you the question again that I asked earlier. When's the last time that you lit yourself on fire? Passion-wise, not literally, because I certainly don't want you to burn yourself. But when's the last time that you lit yourself up with the passions and the joys so that you can help others see their true potential, but also see yourself with that true potential as well? Can you be that guy? Can you be that gal for somebody else that might be struggling with that energy level? Can you associate with different people that might be helping you to get to where you need to go? But I think more importantly, above all else, when's the last time that you visited someone that is really struggling, reached out your hand and said that it's okay, I'm here to help, and you gave them help with no strings attached? Simon is the epiphany of something that I think this world really needs right now from everybody, not just him and not just me or not just anybody else. We need to start having a conversation about what's really important, which is about listening, which I've had many different conversations on this show about different organizations that have been working towards that vision. But at the same time, I want you to know that your journey of healing, of sustainment, of seeing the true version of yourself doesn't have to be rooted in pain. It can be rooted in purpose. I hope that today's show gives you hope to know that there are some good people in this world that are willing to help you no matter what. But at the same time, if you think that you are struggling with something that you cannot do on your own, seek help. A long time ago, I didn't do that, and it led me into a place that was very dark indeed. But at the same time, I found my light. I found my purpose. And if I'm able to do that, if I'm able to find that opportunity, just like many of my other guests have, including Simon today, I have hope for you. Do not give up, because I know you are the light of the world, and you're going to help so many people with that energy that you've been building up all along, to surround yourself with community, to take on the next step of this great adventure that we call life. And all it means is just starting out with helping just one person, even if that's you. Thanks for listening to episode number 119 of Speaking from the Heart, and I look forward to hearing from your heart very soon.
Thanks for listening. For more information about our podcast and future shows, search for Speaking from the Heart to subscribe and be notified wherever you listen to your podcasts. Visit us at www.yourspeakingvoice.biz for more information about potential services that can help you create the best version of yourself. See you next time.